and Music Review Show. This is the Books and Music Review Show, and we generally air on Saturdays at 12:30 in parts of New York City and sometimes in other cities, depending. So, what we have today is a very interesting topic, and we're going to present to you Gerard.
Thank you for that warm introduction. Today, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Brexit. Some of you may have heard about the recent EU elections. These were elections to the European Parliament, the only even quasi-democratic institution in the EU, even though it's not very democratic, as I'll explain shortly. But there was a series of elections around Europe for the European Parliament, and the biggest triumph for the anti-European Union side of the equation occurred in Britain, where the Brexit Party, which had just formed a little over 6 weeks ago, so about a month and a half ago, it was incorporated. They won over a third of the vote, which was the largest share in the UK, and they were headed by Nigel Farage, who was the former chairman of UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, which was a party designed from the outset to sever the ties between the United Kingdom and the European Union. It was created in large part because of the ouster of Margaret Thatcher and the political aftermath of that event, where John Major started to bring the United Kingdom closer and closer to the institutions of the European Union and lessen the sovereignty exercised by the UK government. So from the ouster of Margaret Thatcher in an intra-party coup back at the end of the 1980s, through Tony Blair and New Labour trying to dramatically alter the landscape of the UK and diminish the power of sovereign institutions in that country, there's been a drive among the European elite to essentially erase the distinctive nature of the United Kingdom and to sort of have it be absorbed into the EU. And UKIP was formed as a direct response to that. And it was incredibly successful, even though at the outset it didn't seem to be that successful, because the European Union just grew and grew and became more and more powerful, and the voices within the UK agitating for the political class to exercise British sovereignty, those voices were marginalized to a large degree, and it didn't seem to be getting that much weight up until the UK EU referendum, of course, which was a referendum that took place in 2016 that essentially severed, or was supposed to sever, all ties between the EU and the UK. And it was greeted jubilantly by the people in Britain and even elsewhere in other parts of the world, other parts of Europe, that wanted to put the European Union, kind of cut it down to size, and wanted nations to exercise their sovereign right as nations to determine their borders and their culture, and to diminish this vast European bureaucracy, which had its tentacles in virtually everything done in Britain, from agriculture to domestic law to even regulating things like the size of soup containers. And the EU UK referendum, i.e. Brexit, the successful result for the people supporting Brexit, was applauded in those circles. Unfortunately, the people that control the media and the ruling political class, the folks at the Guardian and the Observer and Fleet Street, quote unquote, all of these people reacted in horror and shock and spent the next 3 years, the better part of 3 years, trying to delegitimize this vote, this exercise of sovereign will on the part of the British people. They tried to destroy what had been achieved through a democratic plebiscite. So even though Nigel Farage resigned from UKIP and he left the scene, he left the European Parliament, the mission was not accomplished, in the sense that the British exercised their right and their will to separate from the European Union, but they entrusted the process to a group of people who wanted to remain in the European Union. The House of Commons, especially the House of Lords, but the House of Commons definitely, and the ruling Conservative Party were all wanted to remain, but they were given the opportunity to thwart this process through incompetence and benign neglect and malign intentions in some part. Because Theresa May, the person chosen to be the prime minister to steward Brexit to fulfillment, was a Remainer. She campaigned against the choice exercised by the British people, and yet she was the one responsible for seeing Brexit through. And as you might know, she recently resigned after clinging tenaciously to power and trying to remain in power to thwart Brexit and institute a very nominal form of Brexit, wherein Britain remained tied to European monetary institutions, to the customs union, remained subject to all of these overbearing European laws. She wanted this Brexit in name only, and did her best to gum up the works, to the point where it's 3 years later and we're still no closer to having a firm break from the European Union. The Brexit was supposed to be accomplished on April 12th. That's what they call a hard Brexit, or a no-deal Brexit. If they couldn't reach an agreement by April 12th of this year, there should have been a complete severing of ties between the European Union and the UK, and a reversion to what's called WTO rules. So like standardized pre-EU rules in terms of trade and diplomacy. And yet that didn't happen. Theresa May, even though she wasn't able to accomplish a vote in the House of Commons in order to institute her version of Brexit, the European Union allowed her to delay this until June 31st, and probably even past that time, depending on what happens in the interim. There's a leadership contest for the Tories, the Conservative Party, right now, and even though a lot of the sentiment would dictate that they elect a pro-Brexit, a genuinely pro-Brexit prime minister, that the era of Theresa May is over. I don't think that's necessarily what's going to happen, because you have numerous people that are simply pale imitations of Theresa May. People like Sajid Navid, who is a Pakistani man who's sort of like a Theresa May light, who's mouthing the platitudes of pro-Brexit politicians, but really doesn't have a firm belief in separating the UK from the EU, much less reinstituting control of the UK's borders. And you have Rory Stewart, who was an administrator in post-Saddam Iraq for the U.S. government, who wants to go on a listening tour. And then, of course, you have Boris Johnson, who was the presumptive prime minister during the last Tory leadership contest, but was stabbed in the back by his own colleague, Michael Gove, who's also running probably a doomed campaign to become the UK's next prime minister. So out of this muddle, there's the hope that you might have a prime minister that's firm, that actually does sever ties between the UK and the EU. But if past is prologue, there's not much hope that the political class will be willing to actually make a hard break with the EU. Something more likely is a second referendum, which has been pushed by hardcore anti-British, pro-EU campaigners who even created their own party, the CUK, Change UK Party, in order to thwart Brexit. And they want to hold a second referendum, even though there's already been a referendum that has explicitly stated that a majority of British people want to extricate themselves from the EU. And the irony is that if the majority had voted to remain in the EU, even if it was by a single vote or a few hundred votes, these same people would be tenaciously maintaining that there's no need for a second vote. There wouldn't even be a campaign for a second vote. So these people are deep-seated hypocrites, like most of the people supporting an EU, supporting the idea that the UK has to remain in the EU. And it's sort of ironic, the way that the political climate has changed in the UK since it signed the European Economic, since it joined the European Economic Community, which was the predecessor to the European Union. This was an organization designed ostensibly to foster deeper economic ties between European states, to foster trade and movement between individual European nations on the continent of Europe. And even at that time, there were people maintaining that this was simply a Trojan horse, that the European Economic Community was simply a means of establishing a European superstate, wherein individual nations had less authority to exercise sovereign will over their borders, over their culture. And this is essentially what's come to pass. The people like Enoch Powell, a British MP who's famous for his Rivers of Blood speech, he was prescient in warning that this was simply simply a means of establishing a European superstate and nullifying and diminishing the rights of individual British, Italian, French citizens. And this is something that's actually turned out to be true. But the irony is that at the time of the EEC, the most fervent opponents of the European Union, the concept of this nascent European Union superstate, were the most vigorous opponents were on the left. People like Tony Benn, a very stridently socialist Labour MP, the people in Plaid Cymru in the Scottish National Party. These, at the time, were genuinely nationalist parties. In other words, they believed in Scottish and Welsh sovereignty, and they didn't believe that only meant being separate from England, but being separate from Europe, having your own national identity. And fast forward, they a lot of the reason that they believed this was because they felt that the European Union, the European community, was simply designed to advance corporate interests. But if you fast forward to the 21st century, it's completely reversed course, and you have the far left Guardian and the Independent and all of these Labour politicians, with a few exceptions such as Jeremy Corbyn. You have all of these politicians basically saying that if you oppose the European Union, you're a racist and you're reactionary, and they want to wed the UK ever more to this European behemoth, this Euro state. And you even have parties like the Scottish National Party and Plaid Cymru arguing vehemently that they should be separate countries, but part of this European superstate. So in other words, we should... they've essentially become anti-English antagonists, and to a large extent, that's the left-wing philosophy. That's why you have so many Remainers, especially these people who want to hold a second referendum, say that London is not England and try to distinguish themselves from England because they think of England as this ethnic identity, and the people in England are racist, these boorish, racist, jingoist, anti-European, anti-multicultural subset of Great Britain. So they refuse to use the English name. They refuse to be considered part of England. And they even take pride in the fact that London is a place where most people are not native-born English. So they see the EU as sort of a club to attack people that they view as racist and xenophobic. And in that sense, the EU is a life preserver for them, even if it means ordinary British people have less say in their courts, in their legal system, in their diplomacy with other nations, in trade. Even if it means the diminishment of the UK, they think that that's a small price to pay for a small price to pay in order to crush their small-minded political opponents. So the idea of being opposed to corporate power and corporate interest has kind of gone by the wayside in pursuit of a very narrow-minded, anti-conservative, anti-English bias, presentiment. And it's kind of interesting when you look at how the feelings of the nationalist feelings that are welling up in England and in the UK, to a lesser extent, have spread throughout the European continent. And this is something that people who support the EU are loath to admit, but is an ineluctable truth. Namely that people in Europe like the concept of the EU. They like the concept of free goodies, grants, especially in some less wealthy parts of the European Union that benefit from the collective pooling of funds. They like the idea of getting EU grants, and there's even and EU subsidies, and there's even a joke in the second Train Spotting playing on the wasteful EU subsidies and the people that benefit from it, in this case in Scotland, where the film takes place. So they like that idea because people like the idea of getting something for nothing. But the idea of actually relinquishing your rights to the EU is something, especially when it means that your nation is going to be ruined in some large measure. They detest that idea, which is why whenever the idea of a European state has been put to the vote, whether it's in France or the Netherlands or the UK, it's been almost wholly rejected. And even in Ireland, the Treaty of Nice, it was Lisbon rather. The treaty, when it was put to a vote, it was rejected. So they had to have another referendum. This is what they're trying to do in the UK. They instituted another referendum, and that was accepted. So they essentially kept voting until the people returned the right, quote unquote, vote. It's sort of reminiscent of a Bertolt Brecht poem, De Losung, where at the end of the poem, the narrator says, "Why don't we elect a new people?" Speaking from the perspective of the communist state, which is being critiqued in that poem. So, in other words, if you don't like the result of democracy, just replace the people, and that's been an ongoing project of the EU, and that's probably why it's so dangerous to remain in the EU, especially after the migrant crisis, which was caused in large part because of people like Nicolas Sarkozy, who demanded an invasion of Libya. And as a consequence, Europe was flooded with millions and millions of refugees. Germany alone took in between 800,000 and 1.2 million, quote-unquote, refugees, some migrants, but in many cases, they're neither refugees or migrants. In some cases, these people are even Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorists. They're jihadists trying to insert themselves into the middle of Europe. And as a result, there have been numerous bombings and atrocities throughout Europe, from the Bataclan massacre to the terrorist incidents and terrorist attacks in Belgium, to massacres in other parts of Europe and thwarted massacres in Germany. The mass rape in Cologne by Arab Muslim migrants, quote unquote, was a result of this catastrophic decision. And this is the kind of thing that you can expect if people like Nigel Farage and Matteo Salvini in Italy and Viktor Orban in Poland and the Law and Justice Party, Viktor Orban in Hungary and the Law and Justice Party in Poland are not allowed to exercise their sovereign right. The pro-Euro, pro-open borders left is trying to gaslight people by saying that Hungary and Poland aren't democratic, even though their governments were elected with overwhelming majority, is simply because they view democratic as a synonym for pro-open borders, pro-multiculturalism, and pro-Euro sentiment. And that's simply not the case. Democracy is simply an exercise of the popular will. Excuse me. And this is what people in Britain are doing right now, and what they've been doing over the past 3 years when they finally had an opportunity to exercise their voice, to exercise their decision-making power. They rejected the EU. And as I said, whenever it's been put up to a vote, it's been rejected. The EU was given consent by virtue of a political class, sometimes in legislatures, and sometimes it was given the imprimatur of public acceptance by a public vote, like the 1975 referendum on the EEC. But the thing is, that referendum and some others like it were consciously misleading the public as to what the European Union, or in that case the EEC, the predecessor to the European Union, what this institution was and what it would do in the future. No one had it in their minds that the EU would decide to have its own military, that there would be a European military, that the Schengen zone would be a pathway for millions and millions of Muslims from North Africa and the Middle East to come into the heart of Europe, or that Angela Merkel, a German prime minister, would welcome them with open arms, even if it meant numerous atrocities throughout Europe, from France to Belgium to Scandinavia. They didn't realize that the EU would represent a nullification of European values in the sense of Western Enlightenment values, and it's simply the case that is what has happened. So even when the public supported the idea of the EU, it was done under false pretenses. When it's come up for a vote, in all honesty, people have given the boot to the EU, and that's something the political class just needs to accept. But unfortunately, we're still struggling through this era where the elites are not recognizing the input of the people that they deign to rule. And it's unfortunate, but that's something that we're going to have to continue to struggle with and continue to make this point, as we did with the Brexit Party and with people like Matteo Salvini and Viktor Orban and others who were successful recently. Even though 2/3 of the European Parliament is still pro-EU, the grip of the Social Democrats and the quote-unquote conservatives has been loosened. So hopefully that's something that's going to continue in the future. And hopefully the EU eventually will be phased out of existence. And I'm glad that you listened to my little explanation of the European Union and Brexit.